Today's daf we're going to be learning is Chullin, daf Kuf Yud Zayin. This week's learning is sponsored by Medina Korn in loving memory of her mother, Rosalie Kachin, Shoshana Rezel Bat Avraham Yoshua Vebela Toiba, Zichronah Levracha, on her 26th Yurtzeit. She had a zest for life and a deep love for family. Her legacy continues to guide us every single day. Today's daf is sponsored by Ayala Ginat in loving memory of Barak Ben Lipa and Shlomit. We're going to get started today on our daf with a new Mishnah. This Mishnah seems a little bit out of place. We're going to have a comparison between chelev and dam, the forbidden fats, and the blood. And with that, we're going to finish the 8th chapter and move to the 9th. If we think about this, what does this have to do with anything? One of the suggestions given for why this is here is because we're going to see there's a difference. The main topic of the Mishnah is we're going to compare. There's stringencies by chelev that don't exist by blood, and there's stringencies by blood that don't exist by the chelev, the forbidden fats. When one of the differences between them, they talk about which type of animals these prohibitions relate to, the behemah, the chaya, the oaf, and that's similar to what we saw in basar b'chalav. It's a possible reason. I have a different suggestion, which doesn't fit as well with the Mishnah, but if you view the Mishnah as part of a corpus of Tanaitic material, it might actually make more sense, which is, in the Mishnah, it didn't really mention the chelev and the dam as relating to basar b'chalav, but we did see sources that darshan the psukim, as we're going to say, if you remember, Shmuel had this tradition, which could have predated him and been in the Tanaitic time period, which is why are there 3 times mentioned? And when we had the 6 possibilities, according to him, that we narrowed down, but if you remember, one was to say chelev is like meat and it's forbidden with milk, and blood is not. So theoretically, that could be why they're mentioned here. Okay, even though the Mishnah doesn't actually relate to it, and it could have, in terms of relating to differences between chelev and dam, it could have talked about, chelev is forbidden to eat with milk, and blood is not. But I do think that it relates, and in any case, let's get started. So the Mishnah starts on the bottom of Kuf Tet Zayin Amud Bet, Chomer b'chelev mi b'dam, v'chomer b'dam mi b'chelev. Each one has stringency, the other one doesn't have. Chomer b'chelev, sha'chelev mo'alim bo. Chelev, now if you remember, in the temple, the chelev would be burned on the altar. In fact, that's the reason why chelev is forbidden in regular animals, because that's the part that gets burned on the altar in the sacrifice, and therefore the chelev in a regular animal is not allowed to be eaten. Not exactly that's why, but there's clearly a correlation. Today we'll discuss that correlation a bit and actually see a case where that's actually not true. But in general, there is this correlation, and that's what we're saying here. In a sacrifice, the chelev is actually going to be a problem of me'ilah, meaning you're not allowed to use the chelev. If you use it for your purposes, you transgress this prohibition of me'ilah, which is misuse of consecrated property. Pigul, notar, and tameh are laws that relate to sacrificial meat, that if someone has a thought while they're slaughtering, for example, the animal, they're going to sprinkle the blood beyond the designated time, then the meat becomes pigul, and if you eat the meat, you're going to get karet. Well, if you eat the chelev, you're also going to get karet for pigul, and notar, if you leave it beyond the time that you're supposed to be eating it, then you also, again, you get karet for eating the meat, and if you eat the chelev, you'll also, and tameh, also if sacrificial items become impure and you eat them, you also get punished, and same thing for the chelev, not just the meat. Masha ain't came bedam, but by blood, none of these are true. You're not going to get you're forbidden to eat the blood because you're forbidden to eat blood, but not blood of a sacrifice that became pigul. You won't be liable for pigul for eating the blood. V'chomer bedam shahadam noheg bebehema v'chaya v'of bein tmeim bein to'orim v'chelev eno noheg ela bebehema to'ora bilvad. Let's start with the chelev. As we said, the chelev comes from prohibition to eat chelev comes from the fact that these are the parts that were burned on the altar in sacrifices. Now, sacrifices are only kosher, domesticated animals. So therefore, the prohibition of chelev is only kosher, domesticated animals. Whereas blood is a prohibition for undomesticated animals and birds, and kosher or non-kosher, it doesn't matter. And obviously, domesticated animals. Now the Gemara starts off with Menahani Mile. Where do we get this from? Now, where do we get what from? It's a good question. Only really if you get to the answer will you know what they're talking about, but you can also look in Rashi, and Rashi helps. Rashi says, "De chelev yesh bo me'ilah." How do we know the chelev has me'ilah? But they don't really mean that, because V'lo maflig. What he's talking about really is that the Mishnah did not distinguish between chaylev of higher level sanctity, kodshe kodshim, which are chatat and olah, and that, not just those, but even kodshim kalim like the Korban Pesach and shlamim, okay, and different lighter level offerings. So even though the lighter level offerings, there's no misuse of consecrated property when they're still alive, okay, when you designate these animals, because Rashi says they're mamon ba'alim. They're considered if I want to bring an animal for a sacrifice for a shlamim, that's my animal, okay, even though I designated it for a sacrifice, because in the end I'm going to eat the meat. It only becomes an issue after I slaughter the animal, and then parts are supposed to be burned on the altar, and that's what they're going to say. The parts that are burned on the altar have me'ilah. But that's a chidush, as we say. It's not so clear, because it didn't have me'ilah before, so why would it have me'ilah now? So where do we get it from? We're going to have two answers, and then try to figure out, why we need both, because we're going to actually have it in the structure, not that there's two answers. There's one answer, and then they're going to ask, but what? What happened to this other one? Why don't you go with what Rebbe said, as we actually saw the same structure a few days ago, but we'll see it inside. Amar Rabbi Yanai, Amar Kra, Ka'ashir Yuram Mishor Zevach HaShlamim. This is in the context of, if you remember the sin offering, there's different sin offerings that different people bring, and one is the Kohen HaMashiach. If you have the Kohen Gadol who was anointed, he brings a special Korban Chatat if he sins, okay, without getting into all the particulars. We learned a lot about it in Horayot, for example, and in other cases as well, other contexts. It says there, you're supposed to burn, and it talks about all the fats, and the yoteret, and the shtei klayot, the different parts of the body that are supposed to be burnt, called the imurim. So there's the chalavim, and the imurim, they're supposed to be burnt. It goes into all the details. And then it says, Ka'ashir yuram mishor zevach hashlamim. Just like we saw in chapter, this is in chapter 4, just like we saw in chapter 3, where in the shlamim, you also need to burn those parts. But now the Gemara says, okay, this is the Braita says this is completely unnecessary. Actually, it's a Gemara. It's Rabbi Yanai says. He's an Emora. What did we learn from Shor Zevach Shlamim? All of what it said by Shlamim was also mentioned here by the sin offering. We didn't need it to say, oh, well, let's learn from there. So what do? They flip it. They say, it's as if, right, we're trying to learn something from the Shlamim, but we already learned it. So what can we do with this? Makish shor zevach hashlamim lapar kohen Mashiach. So we're going to make a comparison the other direction. We're going to say that we're going to learn about the shlamim from the bull offering of the Kohen Mashiach. The mapal Kohen Mashiach yesh bo me'ilah, af shor zevach hashlamim yesh bo me'ilah. Just like a par of the Kohen Mashiach has a din of me'ilah, likewise, the shore of the Zevach HaShlamim is going to have Me'ilah. Okay? What we want to learn here is, also for the Kodshim Kalim of the Shlamim, there's going to be Me'ilah, misuse of consecrated property. Okay? By the Chalavim. Okay? By the fats, and really the Imurim. Okay? Which we'll get to in a minute. Amar Rabbi Chanina. Ke'ura zo sheshana Rebbe. So Rabbi Chanina says to Rabbi Yanai, what? Is it ugly? Remember we saw this term the other day. Is this ugly to you, what Rebbe taught, meaning, are you ignoring a drasha that preceded you? Kol chelev laHashem. Okay, the concept of this pasuk is to say, right, all chelev to Hashem, you can't eat. Okay, here's the pasuk, let me just read it. Vayikra, chapter 3, verse 16. Viktartam akohen hamizbecha, lechem ishel l'reach nichoach. Okay, the kohen is supposed to burn this on the altar. Kol chelev laHashem. It's not talking about forbidden, what you can't eat. It's talking about what goes on the altar. And it says, all the chelev is for God. So what do you learn from here? That, l'rabot. Now why call all the chelev? L'rabot imurei kodshim kalim l'me'ilah. It's to say that the imurim also of the kodshim kalim have a law of me'ilah, not just the chelev, because kol chelev comes to include the imurim as well, which is the yoteret and the shtei klayot that we were talking about. So now, Amar Abai. So the question is, why did Rabbi Yanai need that other pasuk if we could have learned it from the Shlamim themselves? Why do we need to learn from this comparison to the chatat of the Kohen Gadol? To which Abai answers, you might have thought that response is to the chelev. That pasuk, is for the chelev. But maybe the yoteret, the diaphragm, and the shtei klayot, and the 2 kidneys would not be included. Therefore, because of the whole drasha is from the word kol chelev, that might mean only all chelev, which is forbidden fats, not these other parts that get burned on the altar as well, the imurim. Therefore, katav rachmana kasher yuram. There, it comes after it mentioned also the chelev and also the imurim, and then it says, we're going to learn from these imurim and chalavim, just like there's milah for them, we're going to learn back to the shlamim as well. And that is the source. So that's why he needs to bring that other pasuk. But now you have to say, well, why did he need them? Why couldn't you just use the shlamim, the pasuk in the chatat of the Kohen HaMashiach? What would be the problem with just that pasuk? What does kol chelev help us with? Hava amina chelev al ya delay tabashor lo. Since the context there of kasher yuram was talking about the par, you might have thought when we compared the par to the shore, to the ox of the shlamim, you might have thought the chelev aliyah. What's the chelev of the aliyah? That's the chelev in the fatty tail of the sheep. The sheep has a special fatty tail, and the chelev has to be burnt also, even though it's not a chelev that's found in other animals, but that has to be burned as well. So you might have thought that the aliyah that's not found in a shore, that chelev of this aliyah, of the tail, maybe is not actually an issue of me'ilah. Maybe it's not kol chelev la, right? Without the kol chelev la Hashem, you might have thought, well, we'll learn that in the shlamim, all the chalavim and imurim are a problem, but maybe not the chelev of the aliyah, because we're learning it from the Par Kohen Mashiach, and therefore maybe we're only learning to the bull ox family, and not things that are found in sheep, like the tail, the fatty tail. Therefore, katav rachmana kol chelev. So we now show why we need also that, well, we need both psukim, and that teaches us what we're looking for. So now, okay, and from the combination of the two, we learn, number one, that the chalavim and the yoteret and the shtei klayot, all the imurim that are burned on the altar, have a law of me'ilah even in kodshim kalim, and we learn that it even includes the chelev of the tail, the fatty tail of the sheep. So now we have a side question about this fatty tail of the sheep. Amalei Rav Meri le Rav Zvid, and from there we're going to finish this section and move on to the blood. Amalei Rav Meri le Rav Zvid, I alya ikre chelev titzarva achila. If the alya is called chelev, then the alya, now we talked about it before, the chelev that's forbidden to eat is parallel to the chelev that was burned on the altar. So if you're now saying that the fatty tail of the sheep was burned on the altar, which we just showed, and there has a law of me'ilah, then wouldn't you assume that you can't eat the fatty tail? But it's not true. If I, not in a sacrifice, but if I have my own animal, my own sheep, and I slaughter it for my own purpose, I can eat the fatty tail. But that doesn't really jive with what we're saying here. So before we get to the answer, but it's clear from this Gemara we're going to have two answers, although the second answer we're going to reject. They're going to explain how we know that the fatty tail can be eaten. Okay? But the real question, and this is something very interesting, that if you look in the Ibn Ezra, okay, the Ibn Ezra on, just opening it for a second, the Ibn Ezra in Vayikra on the Torah, in his commentary on the Torah in Vayikra chapter 7, verse 20, which we won't discuss the context there, but he mentions that there's a big machloket between the Sadducees and the Pharisees, the Tzdukim and the Prushim, on this issue. Okay? Because the Tzdukim, who often take the literal meaning of the text, they have a very clear, and they less rely on the tradition of the rabbis, they claim that the aliyah is forbidden for what seems like a logical argument. And he explains, the Ibn Ezra, Pamacha bai like Tzduki achav v'shahalani. A Tzduki came to me, a Sadducee, and said to me, Im ha'aliyah surah min ha'torah, is it forbidden? Va'am va'omar amet, ki aliyah tikra chelev, ki ken chatuv chabor aliyah tmima, rak kadmonenu hitirua. He said, yes, you would think it is because it's called chelev, but the early commentaries, right, the kadmonenu, it's not so clear what that is, but it was permitted. Okay, basically meaning it was a rabbinic tradition, an early rabbinic tradition, that it's permitted to eat. So the Tzduki, the Sadducee, argues back and forth with him about it and says, but it makes no sense what you're saying, and actually that's what the Gemara is saying also. But the Gemara is going to give some sense to it, but know that this is actually a machloket that continued throughout the ages between the Sadducees and the Pharisees. With that, we'll continue. Rav Meri says, so I don't understand. If the aliyah is chelev that gets burned on the altar and has a law of me'ilah, what we just explained, then it should be forbidden to eat, and why is it not? Amar lei, alech amar kra, kol chelev, shor, v'kesev, ve'ez. okay, which is don't eat the chaylev of all those. Now notice it says the shor, the kesev, and the ace. So the ox, the sheep, and the goat. Davar hashaveh b'shor v'kesev v'ace. It has to be chaylev that exists in all three of those. And that's why the chaylev is excluded from the prohibition to eat chaylev. Rav Ashi gives a different answer. Rav Ashi amal chilbo ha'alya ikre. With the chaylev of the alya is called chilbo ha'alya, meaning it has a modifier. Chaylev stamalo ikre, but it's not called chaylev without a modifier. We've had this a lot of times, where we claim that a word in the Torah means that only when it has no modifier. When it has a modifier, it's out of the category. So the Gemara says, that sounds very nice, but there's a big problem, because didn't we just say kol chaylev Hashem includes the chaylev of the aliyah? So, elameata lo yimaluba. Well, then you should say there's no me'ila if you use it, right? If it's a sacrificial chaylev of tail, of the fatty tail, there shouldn't be me'ila. And we just said there is, because it's including kol chaylev. You can't say in one situation it's not included in chaylev because it has a modifier, and the other situation is included in chaylev because it has a modifier, and therefore they reject Rav Ashi and say ela mechuvarta kid Rav Zvid. It sounds a lot more like Rav Zvid is correct. Okay, now we're moving on. That was section number 1. Section 1 of the Gemara was to explain how do we know that chaylev in kochim kalim also has a law of me'ila, the first halacha in the Mishnah, and we learned it from 2 different psukim, and we explained why we had a need for both psukim. From that, got off on a tangent about the chaylev of the aliyah. Now we move on to the blood. Masha ein kein bedam. We don't have a prohibition of blood, of me'ila. So now they're going to say, menane mile. Where do we get this from? For this, we're going to have 3 answers. Amar ula, da amar kra. We're going to darshan these psukim. Okay, so the first pasuk is, ki nefesh habasal badamhu. Okay, they're all actually be darshan from this pasuk, so let's read the whole thing. Nefesh habasal badamhu, because the soul of the meat is in the blood. V'ani netativ lachem, I gave it to you, ala mizbeach l'chaper al nafshotechem. I gave it to you to put it on the altar to atone for yourselves. Ki hadam hu b'nefesh yechaper, because the dam, we're going to darshan this word hu soon in the third explanation. Okay, it is b'nefesh yechaper. It will atone for the soul. So let's explain the drashot. Amar ula da amar kra lachem. So it says, I gave the dam to you. What does it mean to you? Shalachem yehei, it's yours, not God's. The opposite of kol chaylev la'Hashem. And that explains the difference. Debei Rabbi Yishmael Tana, in the house of Rabbi Yishmael, they said, l'chaparan etati v'lo l'mi'ila. I gave it to you for atonement purposes, not for mi'ila purposes. In other words, it has a purpose. Its purpose is to atone for you. Not that it will be for God and forbidden. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Kra, Rabbi Yochanan says the pasuk, Rabbi Yochanan Amar Kra, the pasuk says who? Who is a word that means it, like it is stable throughout. So what do we learn from this? Hu lefnei kapara k'la'achar kapara. Its status before you use the blood for atonement, meaning before you pour it on the altar, is going to remain the same as it won't change between before and after. Meaning its status before will be like its status after you sprinkle the blood. Now, so what's the status after you sprinkle the blood? What's obvious to them is once you use the blood to atone for, if the blood is no longer forbidden to use. And therefore, okay, in a minute we're going to have to see how we know this, but so likewise, before atonement, there's no law of me'ila. So now the Gemara asks, why don't you say, you could say the exact reverse. You could still keep the hu drasha and say, no, maybe before the blood has me'ila, and therefore even after you sprinkle the blood, it still has me'ila. So then maybe you would say it has me'ila, and you would come to the opposite conclusion. So ma lifnei kapara yesh bo me'ila, just like before atonement it has me'ila, af lachar kapara yesh bo me'ila, even after atonement it has me'ila. To which the Gemara answers, ein lecha davar shenaseh mitzvato umo'alim bo. There's no such thing. Once you finish the mitzvah, there's never a prohibition to benefit from it. You're done with it. It's nothing anymore. It doesn't have its significance. It doesn't have its status. So once the blood is sprinkled, the mitzvah is done, and of course it doesn't have me'ila, and that's why we're going to say if the status remains the same throughout, then it must be that the status before is like the status after, and it doesn't have a law of me'ila. Well, now the Gemara wants to question this assumption. Where do you get it from? What do you mean? We'll give you a bunch of cases where even after the mitzvah is done, it's still forbidden to benefit. So they're going to say, Velo, v'harei trumat hadeshen. If you remember, every day or very early in the morning, the first avodah they would do in the temple was to sweep the ashes left over from the sacrifices that went burning throughout the night, And they would put it from the whole previous day. They would take some from the ashes, and they would put it next to the altar. It says, V'samo etz al hamizbeach. They would put it on the floor next to the altar, and it would absorb into the ground, meaning you can't use it for any reason. It's forbidden to benefit. And what do you see? Trumat hadeshin denaseh mitzvato mo'alim ba. The mitzvah is already done, and yet there's a law of me'ilah. Dichtiv, how do you know? Because it says, V'samo etz al hamizbeach. It has to be placed next to the altar. To which they answer, no, that's because, so now if you have one example, then that usually builds the paradigm. So maybe we could say other mitzvot like that would still have me'ilah, like the sprinkling of the blood. But our classic answer is, Mishum have trumat hadeshen ubigdei kehuna shnei ktuvim habeim ke'echad. We've seen, by the way, this whole sugya. And chol shnei ktuvim habeim ke'echad ein melamdim. So the trumat hadeshen and the clothes of the kohanim are both exceptions to the rule. We have two exceptions, right? When you have two, we say, two means we don't build a paradigm anymore. So we have these two cases. Big Day Kuna, what are we talking about? The Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur would wear two sets of clothes. He would wear his regular clothes, but when he went into the Kodesh Kodeshim, he would switch into clothes that, now the regular Kohen Gadol has different clothes than a regular Kohen. He has 8 garments, and the regular Kohen has 4 garments. But when he went into the Kodesh Kodeshim, he wore the regular Kohen garments. So what do you do with those clothes after Yom Kippur? There's a machloket about it. Right now we're going to see one side of the machloket, which is, hanicha leman da'amar hinicham sham. And you put them down there. What's the drasha? Melamed, in other words, it says, when the Kohen finishes, it says he puts them down. What does it mean? Melamed shetunim geniza. They need to go into geniza, meaning you can't use them ever again. So those Kohen Gadol clothes can never be used again. And then we're going to say, we have Trumat Hadeshen, and we have the Big Day Kuna. Those are two exceptions to the rule. Anytime you have two, where one builds the paradigm, two says, these are the only two exceptions. Everything else that you finish the mitzvah is not forbidden to benefit, and that would explain our blood. Rabbi Dosa holds, no, they don't go into Geniza. You just can't use them for another Yom Kippur. Okay, they can be used, but not for. Okay, but a Kohen head yoke can actually use them. A regular Kohen can use them. What's the issue? The issue is, right, this is an interesting thing. Is it because the Kohen Gadol used them on Yom Kippur, right? They can never be used and they have to go into Geniza? Or is it that next Yom Kippur you can't reuse clothes that were used for a different Yom Kippur? Kohen needs special clothes, right, that weren't used already for a different Yom Kippur. But anyone actually can use them during the year, because again, a regular Kohen can wear those clothes during the year. So if you say that, then there's no prohibition to benefit, and then you only have one, and then that should build the paradigm. To which they say, we're going to use a different example. The egla arufa, when you find a dead body and you measure the closest city, you don't know who killed the person, so they do this whole ceremony of egla arufa. After you break the neck of the egla, you can't benefit from that animal anymore. It's forbidden to benefit. So now we have two cases, Trumat Hadeshen and Egla Rufa, where the mitzvah was already performed, and yet it's still forbidden to benefit. So there you have Shnei Ktuvim B'im Ke'echad, V'chol Shnei Ktuvim B'im Ke'echad, Ein Melamdim. So there's your answer. And that's why blood is not forbidden to benefit from after, and since it's not forbidden to benefit after, we say, who means it keeps the same status, so even before it must have been not forbidden to benefit from. However, one more last question on this, that's if you assume one builds a paradigm, two means it's an exception to the rule. But some people think two, you could still build a paradigm from them. It's only once you have three that it's an issue. So what are you going to say? Because we don't have a third case. Well, the Gemara is going to answer, and with this we move to Amud Bet. Tre mi'ute ktive. There's two exclusionary words in the two cases that we have, Trumat Hadeshen and Egla Rufa, which seems to indicate it's only here and nowhere else. Hachaktiv visamo, it says, and put it next to the altar, this and nothing else. And hatamktiv ha'arufa, the one whose neck was broken, meaning only this one, but not any other one, meaning other cases are different from this. These are exceptions to the rule and do not build a paradigm. So that finished up that section, but we have one more thing, which is, in the end, let's just go back to the beginning of the section, which is, we had these three psukim that taught us, right, according to either lachem, or lechapel, or hu. Three different words in that same pasuk, right, which each rabbi darshaned it in a different way. to teach the same halacha. So the obvious question is, well, I don't know if you would say obvious. You could say, well, each one learned it from a different verse. But the point is, if really all these three verses seem to be saying the same thing, tlata cry lama libidam, so why do we need these three, not verses, but three words in the verse, to each teach the same thing? Chad lemiutim notar, chad lemiutim me'ila, v'chad lemiutim tuma. Remember, dam doesn't have, right? What laws is not true for dam that we saw in the Mishnah? For blood, number one, there's no me'ila. Number two, there's no notar, there's no pigul, and there's no tame. Did it in the wrong order. Pigul, notar, v'tame. You'll see in a minute why I messed up the order. Because the Gemara here says, of the three psukim, now we have four in the Mishnah, but three of them are derived from these three psukim. One, that there's no notar, and that's why I had that in my head first. One, that there's no me'ila, and one, that there's no tuma. In other words, the laws of notar, me'ila, and tuma don't apply to blood. That's what each of them comes to exclude. Now, what about pigul? We don't have a pasuk for pigul. Well, the Gemara tells us, "Aval mipigul lo tzarich kra." You don't need a pasuk for pigul. Why is that? Ditnan, it says in the Mishnah, kol sheyesh. You might remember this from Svachim. Kol sheyesh lo mitirin bein la'adam bein lemizbech chayavim alav mishum pigul. V'dam gufei matirhu. The dam is a permitter. It's not an object that becomes permitted. Okay, what does that mean? You might remember this, you might not. But what has a law of pigul generally? The meat or the parts that are supposed to get burned on the altar. Because that's an item that you do some action, like sprinkle the blood, and that permits the meat to be eaten, and the parts that are supposed to be burned on the altar to be burnt on the altar. So if you have a thought while you're slaughtering the animal that you're going to sprinkle the blood beyond a designated time, the pigul will apply specifically to what was permitted from that, which is specifically the meat to be eaten or the parts to be burned on the altar. That's why it says bein la'adam bein lemizbech, whether it's a permitted item to the person to consume or permitted item for the altar to consume. But the item that permits the blood is a permitter. Without sprinkling the blood, you can't eat the meat and you can't burn those on the altar. So the blood is a permitter, and it's not something that ever becomes permitted because you can't ever eat the blood. And right, it's a permitter, not something that's permitted. So therefore, we end up saying this is why pigul. You don't even need a verse. It's just obvious that pigul is not going to apply to the blood. Okay, meaning if you eat the blood, you will not be obligated because of pigul. And with that, Hadran alach kol basar, we finish the chapter. Moving on to the next chapter. Now we get into laws of impurity. Okay? Ha'or v'ha'rotev v'hakifa v'ha'alal v'hatzamot v'hagidim v'hakarnayim v'hatzlafayim mitzdarfim l'tamei tumat ochlin avalo tumat nevelot. Okay, that was a big mouthful. Let's try to explain. So first, let's explain all the items we're talking about. We're talking about the hide. Okay, and let's talk about the end maybe. We're going to talk about two types of impurity. One is impurity for food, tumat ochlin, which is if I, let's say, sheretz, a dead creature of one of these creepy crawlers that carry impurity, touches food, it makes it impure. That would be a rishon. Also, if you have something that's already a rishon, like let's say the sheretz touched a person, the person will become tamei as well, because an avatuma can be metame person and vessels, or food and drink. But that item becomes a rishon, and a rishon can only pass on impurity to food and drink. So that's tumat ochlin. Now, first of all, one thing you have to know is tumat ochlin. We'll just give you some details that are going to be helpful for the continuation. Tumat ochlin, it needs to have the shear of kibetza, of a size of an egg, which is bigger than the size of an olive, in order to pass on impurity. So let's say an object became impure. If it had a kibetza, it could pass on impurity to the next level of impurity, right? To a sheni, for example. So food needs a kibetza. We're going to talk about this requisite amount later. That's why I'm mentioning it now. There's a big machloka between the Rishonim whether food to become impure also needs to be the shear of a kibetza or not. Okay, meaning if, let's say, a sheretz fell on a very small particle of food, perhaps it becomes tamei. Some of the commentaries think that. Perhaps it also needs to have a kibetza even to become impure. It can't even become impure without having that requisite amount. There's a machloket about that. Whereas a nevela, if an animal just dies on its own, which is a higher level of impurity because food is either a rishon or a sheni, as I just explained, and it itself is not impure. It's only impure because it became impure by something else. Nevela, it itself just becomes impure. When the animal dies, the meat is nevela. And that needs, let's say I touch a nevela, I'll become impure. Or food touches a nevela, it will become impure. The nevela itself is a rishon, but it needs a shear of a kazayit. It has to be an olive bulk of flesh in order to pass on impurity. If there's a little teeny piece of an animal, from a carcass of a dead animal, of the meat that's sitting around there, and I touch it, I won't become impure. It needs to be an olive bulk. Okay? Now, so they have different requisite amounts, kibetza or kazayit, to pass on impurity, and maybe even to become impure, right? The food might need a kibetza, that's a machloket. There's actually a very interesting thing about it, because there's two different Rashis and two different Masechtot that seem to imply different things. Besides that the commentary is cited in different places, even Rashi himself, there's a contradiction within Rashi about this, or at least it seems. Anyway, now we're going to talk about, now for something to become tumat ochlin, it has to be food. And for the nevela to be tumat ochlin, it has to be also the meat of the carcass, not the bones or things like that. But now we're going to say that bones, okay, now the question is, where are all these things are these, okay, there's one more thing I want to mention, which is, okay, meat needs to be the meat, or items that are edible, right? To become tumat ochlin, for example, it could be anything that can be eaten. So the things that we're going to list here are not really food, but theoretically they could kind of be eaten, okay? It's a little bit tricky. So, or the skin, or the rotev, or the sauce, right? That's like the congealed gravy kind of thing, the juices that come out of the meat, and the kifa, which is the spices that get stuck at the bottom of the pot. Now, these things often get eaten together with the meat. They're not really called food, but they do get eaten together with the meat often. The halal, okay, this is going to be a machlok at what this is. Some people say it's when you cut off the skin. I actually just had this the other day. I was cutting off skin of raw salmon, and some of the salmon came with the skin. Okay, now usually, like, I just threw it out. Right, it's not really food. No one's going to eat that piece of meat that's left on the skin. Okay, so that's halal according to one interpretation. We'll get back to it later in the Gemara, the different interpretations. Atzamot are bones. They have a little meat on them, because no one eats the bones unless they have marrow in them. That's a different story. We're talking about bones without marrow that have a little meat attached to it. The gidim, the sinews, which also sometimes get eaten with the meat. Hakarnayim, the horns. We don't mean the whole horn. We mean, again, the part that's close to the meat that has a little bit of meat on it. The tlafayim, the hooves, that either has a little bit of meat on it, or, one thing I didn't mention, which I meant to mention when we talked about the hide, there's a category of impurity, which we're going to talk about today, which is called a shomer. If you have something that's protecting the food, like, for example, the hide protects the meat. The tlafim, the hooves, protect the legs, right? The meat on the legs, so on the feet. So these are called protectors. Now, the protectors can actually become impure as well, okay, because they protect it. And yadot, which we didn't get to yet, but yadot are handles. Okay, there's a whole Masechet Uktzin, which we're going to talk about in our chapter here, which is, if I have a stem of a fruit and you hold the fruit using the stem, then that's a yad. If the yad, meaning the stem, is touched by a sheretz, let's say, or a person who's impure, that passes on impurity to the fruit, even if no one's touching the fruit. Okay? Or here, we're going to see now, mitztarfim l'tamei tumat ochlin. These are counted in a requisite amount to say, oh, does this have a requisite amount to pass on impurity? Okay? All these things, either because they're eaten together with the meat, or because they're a shomer, they protect the food. So they do combine to get to the requisite amount to say, oh, this food can pass on impurity, or perhaps even become impure, depending on which side you hold in that machloket. Avalo tumat nevelo. But if we have meat of a dead carcass, and on it there's some hide or rotev or something like that, and we don't have a full kazayah with the meat only, but yes, together with this we do, it's not going to be mitzareh for tumat nevelo. Okay, we're going to see, because tumat nevelo is much more severe, because it actually is an avatuma, whereas food can only be a rishon or a sheni. So we're going to be more lenient with we're not going to have the strict level of impurity with something that's less, right? We're going to be more lenient on the stricter. Right? It's usually sometimes the reverse, but what they're going to say is, for the lighter level tumah, this will be enough to actually mean that it's impure, and also because you could sort of look at this as food, but it's not considered part of the tumah of nevela. Okay, we don't exactly know why this is right now. Kayotzebo, likewise, hashochet behemat me'ah le'ovei kochavim u'mefarkeset. We might remember when we learned laws of shechita, we said if you shecht an animal, even if the animal is still flailing, it's actually immediately considered dead and has the tumah of a nevela. But a non-Jew, it's not dead until it's really dead. In other words, it's not pronounced dead, as this has a law of nevela, till the animal is completely dead, meaning not flailing anymore, because shechita is irrelevant for a non-Jew. Here we have a bit of a mix of a case, because we have, and not only nevela, but is it food yet, right? It's not food. It's food for a Jew as soon as slaughtering is done, because the Jew can eat it. It's not food for a non-Jew, because the non-Jew who keeps the mitzvah of B'nai Noach can't eat the food without it being completely dead. Okay, so we're now going to say the following. We have a mixed case. We have a Jew, hashochet behema, who does shchita for an animal that's tmeah, that's not a kosher animal. Lo'ovei kochavim, and he does it for a non-Jew. Umifarkeset, and the animal's still flailing. Now you did shchita, which for the Jew actually would work, but he's actually feeding it to a non-Jew because it's not even kosher, so it can't work for him. Well, we're going to say mitama chumat ochlin. It will be food because for a Jew this would have been food, even though the Jew's not eating this, but it's enough to consider it food since he's doing it for someone who would eat it. Avalo chumat nevela, but it doesn't have nevela, the impurity of nevela, rosho, until it dies completely, or it chops off its head, which is considered death for a non-Jewish animal. And this is what we said before. It's easier to get to impurity of food rather than it is to get to impurity of a nevela, which we saw from both cases in the Mishnah. This is still the Mishnah talking. Rabbi Yehuda is almost like the Mishnah is commenting and summarizing what we learned so far. Rabbi Yehuda Omer ha'alala mechunas. Let's say I cut that salmon and I had all these pieces and by accident I cut off way too much of the salmon. So ha'alala mechunas, if I collected a bunch of these meats together that were on the hides, what does it show? It shows that remember with impurity, it's all about what I intend to do with it. If I collected them all together, im yesh bo kezayit b'makom achad, and there's an olive bulk of meat together with all these pieces of skin with the meat on it, chayav alav. Then I would be obligated to nevela because I've shown that I'm considering this important and I'm not just throwing it in the garbage. Now the Gemara starts off and says, if we talked about that there's the issue of shomrim, which is the skin, and the tlafim, the hooves, which protect the feet, have impurity of ochlim, but not nevela, we're now going to show this. We're now going to say there's a braita that says this also. Tanina lahad detanu rabanan. You can see this braita that shows what the Mishnah said. Shomrim l'tumah kala v'lo shomrim l'tumah chamura. Shomrim, as I said before, they have impurity, even though they're not really food, but they have impurity for tumah kala, for food impurity, lighter impurity. For lo shomrim l'tumah chamura, but they don't have loss of impurity for higher level impurity of a nevela. They don't become an avatuma. It's much harder to become an avatuma. It's easier to become something that could pass on impurity at a lower level. So shomrim l'tumah kala minal. And where do we get the source that the shomrim work for tumah kala for light impurity? Detana debei Rabbi Yishmael. Al kol zera zerua. They forget the important part of the pasuk. Asher yizareh. On any, this is the pasuk about asher. It falls on any seed that is planted. Asher yizareh. That you planted. Well, that you planted is completely unnecessary. So what do they learn from this? The way that people take things out to plant. When you plant a seed, you plant a grain of wheat or a grain of barley with its peel on it. Okay, it has the outer layer. So, likewise, the shomer, when it has its klipa on it, its peel, and that becomes impure, right? That's going to be part of loss of impurity. It's going to also pass on impurity to what's inside, even if nothing touched what's inside, for tumat ochlin, for impurity of food. So chita b'klipata, the chita with its peel, the sorah b'klipata, the barley with its peel, and adashim b'klipata, and also lentils with their peel, their outer layer. So their outer layer can cause, if it comes in contact with something impure, it will make the whole item, the whole grain inside impure. V'lo shomrim l'tumah chamura minala. Now, how do we know that there's no law of shomrim for the tumah of a nevela? And with this, we'll finish for today. Ditanu rabanan bin nivlata. This is about if a sheretz comes in contact with a nevela. I'm sorry. No, I didn't say that right. Completely quite the wrong thing. Let's go back. The pasuk here is when an animal dies. Kol hanogeh b'nivlata yitma. Anyone who touches its dead body. Now, you could have just said. Okay, so the pasuk starts off, ki yamut min habehema. When an animal dies, asher hi lachem lo'chla, that you would eat. Hanogea b'nivlata yitmar ha'erev. Now, it just sort of said hanogea ba. So obviously it would be the animal that died. Why does it say b'nivlata? V'loba or she'ein alav kazayit basal. Not the hide that doesn't have kazayit of meat. If there's no kazayit of meat there, then the hide is not going to be, which is what we said in the Mishnah. The or and all those other things are not mitami tumat nevelot, and that's learned from b'nivlata. Okay, to summarize, we did three main things today. We compared dam and chelev. From there, we had two sugyot. One was, how do we know that there's me'ila, which was one of the laws of chelev, in the chelev of kodshim kalim, even kodshim kalim. We had two psukim to prove it, right? We brought one. We said, what about this other? Did you ignore that drasha? And then we explained why you need both. We had a side question from there about the aliyah, and we talked about the stuki prushi machloket about there. Second sugya was about the blood, the three different drashot we had, and then at the end, why did we have three of them? What did each one teach us? About how we know there's no blood from me'ila. In the end, we learned from there's no law of blood from me'ila. There's no me'ila by blood. There's also no pigul, and there's no notar, and there's no tameh. Okay, there's also no din of blood for those, and that we learned from the three psukim, plus the pigul we didn't even need a pasuk for. And then we started the new chapter we learned about shomrim and yadot, even though yadot didn't come up in the Gemara yet, but how shomrim also have impurity specifically for tumat ochlin, not for tumat nevela, and all these other items that are kind of not really food, but sort of could be eaten together with the meat, that they're going to have tumat ochlin. They're going to join, meaning you can use them to come up with the requisite amount for something to pass on impurity and maybe even to become impure for ochlin, but not for nevelot. And we saw another case where we distinguished between those two, and then we just started bringing sources for how do we know a shomer is in tumakala and it's not in tumachamura. From there we finish for today, wishing everyone a good day.